If you don't understand Japanese, you don't fully understand Faye Valentine. Don't get me wrong, the English dub of Cowboy Bebop is excellent. The acting, the script, and Wendee Lee's portrayal of Faye Valentine. It's all top tier. But whenever you adapt something into another language, parts of it inevitably change. Cowboy Bebop is no exception, and I really noticed this when I recently rewatched the series. I first watched Cowboy Bebop back when it was originally released on DVD in the US. Yes, I'm old. Anyway, after that, I came to rewatch it plenty of times during the old Cartoon Network days. But I hadn't rewatched it in well over 10 years, so I decided to give it another watch. But this time, I decided to pay close attention to the language used in the original Japanese. And as a result, I noticed quite a few interesting things, especially when it comes to one specific character. And that character is Punchy. Yeah, the guy from Big Shot. You know, the guy that says, "Amigo!" Okay, no, while I love Punchy, I'm not talking about him. I'm talking about the purple-haired, yellow hot pants wearing woman who is responsible for the sexual awakening of millions of anime fans around the world, Faye Valentine. By the way, for the record, I'm not one of those weirdos that thinks Faye Valentine is attractive. She's a cartoon character. I mean, come on, like who would ever be attracted to a cartoon character like her? It's not me. Not one bit. Never has the thought ever crossed my mind that she is extremely attractive. Anyway, where were we? Oh yeah, we were talking about language. So here's the thing. There's a lot of really interesting nuance in the language that Faye uses in the original Japanese. But it's really difficult to fully convey this in English. And I'm not just talking about the English dub, I'm also talking about the English subtitles. So in today's video, I want to dig into the language of Faye Valentine in order to help you better appreciate the incredible writing of one of the best anime of all time, Cowboy Bebop. Hey guys, Tony here. If this is your first time here, welcome to the channel. I make videos about anime localization, and well, I make a lot of videos about Dragon Ball as well. If you're into that kind of thing, make sure to hit the subscribe button, leave me a like, and let me know in the comments what is your favorite episode of Cowboy Bebop. Let's start at the beginning. Faye Valentine makes her debut in Honky Tonk Woman, which is episode 3 of Cowboy Bebop. As I'm sure you remember, Faye Valentine makes quite the entrance, but we're not going to focus on how the camera lingers on various parts of her body, almost as if to invite the viewer to... where were we? So Faye enters the scene and she has an interaction with a shopkeeper who is presumably Chinese. The first few lines they exchange are done in this peculiar style of Japanese that is supposed to sound Chinese. Basically, they communicate in kanji compounds and Chinese-derived pronunciations. That part, although really interesting in its own right, isn't relevant to what we're talking about here, so we're just going to set that aside and keep going. Anyway, after a few lines of this pseudo-Chinese Japanese, Faye switches to regular Japanese, and it quickly becomes apparent that she uses something that is often called Japanese women's language. Also referred to as Japanese women's speech, this is basically a collection of sentence endings, vocabulary, intonation patterns, and politeness levels that all come together to form a speech style that sounds stereotypically feminine. And of course, we're talking about stereotypes here, so that means that not every single female in Japan speaks like this. Also, some males use elements of women's speech, and some elements of women's speech are pretty neutral these days, so they're used by both men and women. That's real life though. In media, for example in anime, it's very common to come across characters who use women's speech extensively. Cute girls, refined ladies, and rich high school girls. These are the kinds of characters that you are most likely to see heavily using women's speech in anime. As for Faye Valentine, well, she too is a heavy user of women's speech. And this becomes pretty apparent once she starts speaking standard Japanese. Here, Faye asks the shopkeeper, "Do you know the first rule of combat?" But the way she says this in Japanese gives this a very distinct feminine feel. You see, in Japanese, there's multiple ways that she could have asked this question. Some ways would have sounded much more neutral, some ways would have sounded much more masculine, but instead, she uses a rising intonation with a plain form verb, and this ends up sounding very feminine. Now, to be clear, just because you use a rising intonation in Japanese to indicate that you're asking a question doesn't mean that you sound feminine. But of course, language is all about the subtle details and context. And yeah, shitteru, do you know, doesn't sound feminine in and of itself. It does depend a lot on when you're saying it, how you're saying it. But in this context, yeah, it definitely comes off as feminine because Faye is using a certain tone of voice. She's also using a more exaggerated intonation pattern. Plus, the scene as a whole presents her as a very flirtatious, seductive character. And so this line reinforces that. It's absolutely in line with this image. It sounds feminine. All right, so now let's move on to the next line. This means something like striking first. Here too, Faye makes use of language that makes her come off as stereotypically feminine. She uses the sentence final particle yo after the noun sensei kogeki. And sensei kogeki means striking first or preemptive strike. In case you're not aware, the sentence final particle yo is used for emphasis. And when you place it after a noun, you get a construction that, well, yeah, it falls under women's speech. All right, so now let's take a look at how the English dub handle these lines.
You know the first rule of combat? Shoot them before they shoot you.
Notice how neutral that sounded. Yeah, it sounds cool and confident and badass, as it should. In Japanese, you also do get that general vibe. But the explicit femininity that you get in the Japanese is pretty much gone. But arguably, things get even more interesting in Faye's final line in this scene. Let's check it out. This means something like, "What a courteous reception." But here's the thing, in Japanese, this line sounds extremely feminine, to the point that it comes off as rather theatrical. First of all, there's the noun. So there's teicho. This means something like courteous. This is not the kind of word that you're gonna hear coming out of the mouth of a high school delinquent. This is a rather proper and polite word. And then we have omukae. Omukae means to go pick somebody up, to go greet somebody. But the important thing here is that this uses the honorific o prefix. So if you slap on that o prefix to some nouns in Japanese, suddenly that noun sounds more proper and polite. And proper refined ladies like to use this honorific o prefix. And then we have the sentence ending dakoto. This is arguably the most feminine and over the top and performative aspect of this sentence, because dakoto doesn't even mean anything. When you slap on dakoto, or in some contexts koto, at the end of a sentence, it makes it sound like you're a proper refined lady. And that's why this scene is funny. So this whole scene presents Faye as this flirtatious, confident, deadly, woman. And then at the end of the scene, everything falls apart. After she shoots up the place, she ends up getting captured. And then in that moment, when it all falls apart, she uses her most refined, proper, ladylike language. And then on top of that, Megumi Hayashibara, the voice actress of Faye in the original Japanese, uses a very exasperated tone and delivery in this moment. And then she even punctuates this with an exhale. So we have proper, refined, ladylike language contrasting with exasperation, and confidence, badassery, contrasting with utter failure. In other words, comedy. Now let's check out how the English dub handled this moment.
Quite an elaborate way to get acquainted.
Honestly, I really like what they did here. Quite an elaborate way to get acquainted. That's not the kind of language you hear coming out of the mouth of a street punk. That's some refined ladylike language. So they definitely kept the general vibe. But overall here, right? This statement, of course, doesn't have that explicit femininity encoded into the language. And then, like I showed you earlier, those two other statements also don't have that extreme aggressive femininity, right? Like, quite an elaborate way to get acquainted. It's still not as over the top as the original Japanese. Now you might be saying, you're nitpicking here. Come on, it's a really good dub. And yes, it is. I've said it before and I'll say it again. It's a good dub. But these little tweaks and changes, they are found throughout the English dub. There is a difference between Faye in the original Japanese and in the English. And these differences are especially notable in moments when Faye has these swings from the hyper femininity to, well, I guess you could say her true self, because Faye is using language as a shield and as a weapon. She's hiding her true emotions in many situations. She's trying to use language, well, like I said, like a shield, but also to manipulate people, to get people to do what she wants them to do. And often this involves a lot of women's language, a lot of, well, insincere usage of language, because that's not what she's actually thinking. That's not her true self. So let's take a look at another moment when this really comes to light. So this happens in episode 4, titled Gateway Shuffle. At the beginning of this episode, Faye is stranded in her ship. She's trying to get help because she needs gas, or at the very least, she needs a ride to go get gas from somewhere. So she hails a passing ship and she tries to get that ship to stop and help her. And this is what she says in the original Japanese. I'll include my English translation on screen.
Hi, そこに接近中の人見えてます？ちょっとガス欠で困ってるんですけど、ガニメデまで乗せてってくれないかしら。もうどいつもこいつもなんで止まんないわけ?
Basically, this translates to, hey, you, the person who is currently on approach over there. Can you see me? I'm in a bit of a pinch. You see, I'm out of gas. I wonder if you could do me the favor of giving me a ride to Ganymede. Oh, come on. Why the hell won't anyone stop? By the way, this is a pretty straightforward and fairly literal translation. I'm not saying this is the translation the English dub should have gone with. I'm just trying to give you a better idea of what was written in the original Japanese. The interesting thing here is the extreme contrast between the first half of what Faye says and the second half. In the first half, we have a proper lady who knows how to be polite. She's a damsel in distress. Please help me. And in the second half, we've got basically the equivalent of a street punk, but I'll talk more about that in a moment. In the first part, Faye really turns up her femininity. She raises the pitch of her voice, she softens the quality of her voice, she uses explicitly formal language, and sentence enders, which, again, all fall under women's language. For example, she uses something called te ne go, literally means formal language, and it refers to des and mas forms. These are the polite and formal forms of verbs, including the copula des. So instead of da, you say des. Instead of taberu, which means eat, you say tabemasu. And Faye rarely does this. She pretty much... I think she only does this in the casino scene in episode 3 when she's working as an employee. And then she also does it in the the Andy episode. You remember the Andy episode where we have the guy that looks like Spike when she's trying to get him to do something and she's kind of trying to manipulate him. She uses te ne go. She uses des and mas form in that moment. There may be one or two other moments, but basically, Faye only uses te ne go, des mas forms, formal language when she's trying to get somebody to do something for her, and this is no exception. Again, she's trying to get a ride from this ship that's passing by. And then at the end of all of this, she uses the sentence final particle kashira, which again is a sentence final particle that makes a statement sound feminine. It's not only used by women. Men occasionally use it, but it has a very soft vibe to it, and it falls, again, under the stereotypical Japanese women's language. But then in the second half of this statement, that feminine mask, it just falls away and we get to see the real Faye Valentine. For example, in this latter part, Faye uses the term doitsumo koitsumo. This means something like every one of these guys, but it's extremely rough and informal language. It's not the kind of thing a proper lady would ever say. This is delinquent language. And you could even, depending on the context, translate it as something like every damn a-hole or every one of these a-holes. That's how rough this term is. So you see how we get this extreme shift in Faye's language from proper and ladylike to rough and masculine. Now, let's check out the English dub.
Hi, I just picked up your signal and, well, I have a slight problem. I'm kind of out of fuel at the moment. So if you could just take me to Ganymede, I'd really appreciate it. Oh, damn it! Why is everyone in such a hurry all the time? Don't they know it's unhealthy?
Again, overall, I think they did a really great job here. In the first part, Faye sounds more proper. You could even say more ladylike. And in the second part, she doesn't sound ladylike at all, right? She's saying, damn it! She's frustrated. So that's good. I think they did a great job in preserving the general vibe of the original Japanese. It's just that I think in the original Japanese, the extreme shift in attitude we see Faye exhibit here is more pronounced, and it's because of the language she uses. And there's plenty of other moments throughout Cowboy Bebop that show a lot of Faye's use of women's language is performative. It is in order to present a certain image of herself rather than to show who she really is, because Faye is an emotionally vulnerable character who would rather run away than run the risk of being hurt. So let's go to episode 15 now, My Funny Valentine. In this episode, we get to see Faye's backstory. It turns out that she had been cryogenically frozen for 54 years. And when she woke up, she didn't have any of her memories. And in this episode, we get a very different Faye. Remember, by this point in the story, Faye has been around for over 10 episodes. So Japanese viewers would be very familiar with the fact that she speaks in this very exaggerated women's language much of the time. However, this younger version of Faye doesn't use the extreme over-the-top women's language that the older Faye sometimes uses. Younger Faye does use some elements of women's language. For example, in Japanese, there's multiple first-person pronouns, and young Faye uses atashi, which is a first-person pronoun that sounds feminine. She also uses feminine-sounding sentence final particles, like no yo. But here's the important thing. Between the way that Megumi Hayashibara performs younger Faye in a more subdued way, and the fact that she doesn't use that much women's language, and she especially doesn't use the really over-the-top stuff, younger Faye ends up sounding much more like a normal person. As for the English dub, again, I think they did a great job here and they kept the general vibe of the original Japanese. However, I think the contrast that exists between younger Faye and older Faye is much more pronounced in the original Japanese, due in large part to the language that each of these versions of Faye uses. I'm not saying the contrast doesn't exist in English, it's just that it's not as severe. Sorry to interrupt, but if you want a t-shirt with some awesome art and you want to support what I do here, check out mekanekosushi.com. There's multiple designs available, and they're all done by an incredible Japanese artist that I know personally. Every purchase supports the channel, and it supports a real Japanese artist. Check out mekanekosushi.com. The link is down in the pinned comment. All right, let's talk about the last example that I have for you. And this is the most significant example. So for this one, we're going to go to episode 24 of Cowboy Bebop. Hard Luck Woman. I love this episode. And actually, I'd kind of forgotten some of the details of this episode when I rewatched it. And then it all came back to me. And I have to admit, maybe I cried just a little bit. Just a little bit. It's such a good episode. And one of the most impactful moments happens between Faye and Spike. So in this episode, Faye gets her memories back. And then she runs out of the shower and she bumps into Spike and she apologizes to him. This is absolutely unfathomable for Faye. The Faye that we've come to know for over 20 episodes by this point doesn't apologize for anything. She's loud, she's abrasive, she's immature, and this is especially the case when she's dealing with Spike. And yet, she actually apologizes. In the original Japanese, she says, gomen.
Gomen.
Gomen means I'm sorry, but something important to point out here is that gomen is the short and more informal form of gomen nasai. Gomen nasai is what you say when you apologize in a formal situation. Well, actually, there's even more formal ways to apologize, but generally speaking, you're going to use gomen nasai in a slightly more proper and formal situation. Perhaps you're apologizing to your boss or maybe to somebody who's older than you. However, gomen is what you use when you apologize to your friends, to your family, maybe to somebody who's younger than you. But the point here is that you're more likely to use gomen with somebody who, well, you actually have some kind of relationship with. You have some degree of closeness with. By using gomen here, Faye gives off the vibe like she's acknowledging the fact that she sees Spike as more than just some stranger or some a-hole, right? Maybe she sees him as a friend or as more than a friend or as almost a family member. Who knows? We can't say for sure. We can talk about that another day. But gomen implies, to me at least, some degree of familiarity. And I love that. I think the use of gomen here rather than something else works great. The other thing going on here with Faye's use of gomen is that this severely contrasts with the over-the-top, performative women's language that Faye has been using as this persona, as this shield throughout much of the series. And the really interesting thing here is that Faye says gomen. Faye says I'm sorry after she comes out of the shower. It's almost as if the shower washed away this facade that she'd built up for herself using women's language and this over-the-top theatrical way of speaking. And what we get after that exit from the shower is the real Faye Valentine. She's got her memories back, and she can't hide her true feelings in this moment. And so we get gomen, something that a normal, everyday person in Japan would say. We don't get ridiculous, exaggerated language. No, we just get genuine language and genuine emotion.
Gomen.
As for the English dub, Faye simply says, "I'm sorry."
I'm sorry.
There's absolutely nothing wrong with this, and again, I think Wendee Lee does a great job. But here's the thing. I don't think that same nuance that exists in the Japanese because of the contrast between gomen and gomenasai is 100% present here. And then on top of that, we have the severe contrast that exists between the Faye that speaks in this over-the-top, exaggerated, stereotypical women's language and the Faye in this moment. The Faye that speaks like a normal human being. I'm not saying that contrast isn't here in the English dub. I think it's here to some degree, but I don't think it's as pronounced. And if you're thinking this is all really subtle stuff, it's not even worth talking about, I would say no, it absolutely is worth talking about, because it's subtle things like this that keep happening again and again and again throughout the series that result in the Japanese fandom having a slightly different impression of who Faye is compared to the English-speaking fandom. But this is just something that happens when you adapt something from one language into another. And I have to admit, I hadn't noticed a lot of these things until my most recent rewatch. But because I rewatched it paying specific attention to the language used, I ended up developing a whole new appreciation for the writing of this incredible show and the character that is Faye Valentine. And I hope this video helped you appreciate those things too. And fine, I'll admit it, I'm a grown man who loves Faye Valentine. I think she's so damn hot, and I'd really appreciate it if you hit the subscribe button. See you next time. Bang!